Hello and welcome back to art. Today we are going to look at the art form of quilting. Quilting is the process of piecing together layers of fabric and padding to make a bed cover. Individuals made these for warmth on the bed, and they also made them for their beauty and appreciation of art and craft. We will look at a group of women from Gee's Bend, Alabama, who made those quilts. We will also read a story about Gee's Bend and Belle, a mule from Gee's Bend. I am especially excited to explore quilt making with you today because I practice the craft myself. I was first introduced to the craft of quilt making when I inherited this quilt from my grandmother. In the 1950s, my grandmother purchased this quilt at her church as a fundraiser. That was more than 70 years ago. After her death, the quilt was passed down to my mother, and about 20 years ago, my mother gave the quilt to me. The next few slides include images of bed quilts and quilted pillows that I have made over the past 10 years utilizing a variety of techniques.
Belle, the Last Mule at Gee's Bend, a civil rights story. Written by Calvin Alexander Ramsey and Betty Stroud, illustrated by John Holyfield. Alex sat on a bench outside the store. He wanted to go and play, but his mother had told him to wait for her. There was nothing to do on the porch but watch an old mule eating in a garden across the street. There was no breeze, not a leaf moved in the chinaberry trees. It was so still Alex could hear the mule munching on a row of bright collard greens. He watched as the mule's big fuzzy ears twitched away a pesky fly. An old woman walked slowly up the wooden steps to the store and sat down on the bench next to Alex. She fanned herself with a folded newspaper. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye. She was watching the mule, too. The old woman chuckled and then said in a soft voice, "Myself, I like my collards cooked with some ham and spiced up with vinegar." Alex smiled. "I was just thinking how that old mule could sure eat collards," said the woman. "Is it allowed to? I mean, eat someone's garden like that?" asked Alex. "Old Belle, she can have all the collards she wants. She earned it." The woman looked straight at Alex and said, "I let her loose, you see, and that's my garden. I thought I'd sit in the shade and rest a bit before I shoot her out. But ma'am, why do you let that mule eat your collared plants?" "My name's Miss Petaway's son," she said. "What's yours?" "I'm Alex," he answered. "Well, Alex, there's enough greens in my garden for both of us, and Belle is a very special mule. She's a hero here in Gee's Bend, and I'd like to show her some respect." What's so special about that old mule? Alex asked as he stood up. The woman took a deep breath. Now that's a long story, but if you have time to sit, she patted the bench. Alex hesitated. He wondered if she was just a crazy old lady, but was curious, and after all, there was nothing else to do. Gee's Bend has always been poor, she began. There's not much here but farmland. We always needed mules to help us work the land. Not many of us could afford a car. How could you get anywhere? Alex asked. Well, that's just it. Benders, that's what we call ourselves here, use mules to haul everything. Belle's been with us for many years now. She was here the day Martin Luther King Jr. came to speak, way back in 1965. I know about Dr. Martin Luther King from school. Did you get to meet him? Alex asked. Oh, yes, sir, I did. That night there was a terrible storm. Lots of people thought he wouldn't make it to see us poor folks. I waited not far from here with Belle. It was past midnight when Dr. King finally arrived, but he still spoke to us that night and nearly took the roof off Pleasant Grove Baptist Church with his wonderful words. What did he say? Alex asked. Well, in those days, we had a ferry to cross the river into Camden, where there were jobs and stores. Dr. King told us to take the ferry to Camden to register to vote. Cross the river for freedom, he sang out that night. Even though we were poor dirt farmers, descendants of slaves, with only mules to carry our loads, he said, I come over here to Gee's Bend to tell you, you are somebody. He told us we had the right to vote. You understand, Alex, back then, no black person from Wilcox County had ever dared to vote. Were you scared? Alex asked. Miss Pettaway sighed and thought for a moment. I don't think we were scared, not after Dr. King spoke to us. We felt strong like our mules, and we did just what he told us to do. So many went to register that we almost swamped that little ferry. Some Benders went on to march with Dr. King in Selma, in Montgomery, in Birmingham, and in the March on Washington. Benders are loyal, like mules too, Miss Pettaway added, chuckling. We read about all those marches in school, Alex added. But we must have scared the white folks in Camden because the next thing we knew, they shut down the ferry. The white sheriff was a big bully who wanted to keep us in our place. He told reporters, we didn't close the ferry because they were black, we closed it because they forgot they were black. So when it came time to vote, we had no way to cross the river, but we wouldn't be stopped. Benders like old Belle here, not fancy, but strong and steady, and stubborn. We filled a few cars with as many people as could fit, and then our mules carried wagon loads of people around the river all day to vote. It took half a day to get there, but it was worth it. We sang and clapped all the way into town. Folks in Camden were sure surprised. You showed them, Alex laughed. Is that why Belle's your hero? There's a lot more to it. A lot of people here lost their jobs in Camden because they voted. Things got bad. With no jobs, we had no money for food, so some of us joined the Freedom Quilting Bee in Alberta and eventually started our own. Called ourselves the Gee's Bend Quilters. You see, the women of Gee's Bend have always made quilts. Some of the most beautiful quilts in the world were made right here. Soon, they were being sold all over the United States. We became famous. That's why I'm here. My mother came here to shop for a quilt today, Alex explained. That's a happy ending, isn't it? But it's not the end of the story for Belle. Miss Pettaway's voice turned softer. Alex, do you remember learning in school what happened on the 4th of April in 1968? Alex looked into Miss Pettaway's eyes and saw how they looked. That's when Dr. King got shot, isn't it? He asked, and for the first time he felt the sadness himself. Yes, everyone in Gee's Bend was grieved. Miss Pettaway took a deep breath and looked out at the trees. A slight breeze seemed to shuffle the leaves. We got a phone call asking if our mules could pull Dr. King's coffin through the streets of Atlanta during the funeral parade. They wanted to use our mules, not fancy draft horses. Mules take their time, work hard, and they never back down. Mules aren't pretty, but they are somebody. It meant so much to us that Benders could honor the memory of Dr. King. Belle and another mule named Ada were loaded onto a truck to begin their journey to Atlanta. But as usual, it wasn't going to be easy. State policemen stopped the truck and asked the drivers to show the permit for hauling livestock across state lines. They threatened to arrest the drivers when they didn't have the papers. They told them they'd have to turn back. We got word to Dr. King's headquarters in Atlanta about what had happened, and they called the state police and the governors of Alabama and Georgia. They told them it would look shameful on TV and in the news all over the nation if they refused to let our mules pull the funeral train. After that, the troopers escorted our Belle and Ada right into Atlanta. Belle pulled Dr. Martin Luther King's coffin? Alex asked. Yes, sir. Belle and Ada's bravery pulled the wagon 3.5 miles through streets that were full of grieving, weeping people. As they passed, people reached out and touched the mules in the casket. Imagine the thousands of arms and hands reaching out to them, but they kept moving, slow and steady. They didn't back down or get scared. They just kept going. The funeral was televised around the world. 60,000 people gathered around Ebenezer Baptist Church. Tens of thousands more lined the streets. We were very proud, and that's why we love our last mule here at Gee's Bend. And that's why I let Belle eat all the collard greens she wants. Alex and Miss Petaway turned to look at old Belle, who stopped her munching and looked up at them. They both laughed. Yep, she's had her filled, Miss Petaway said, slowly raising off the bench. Want to go meet her? Yes, ma'am. Alex skipped down the steps and over to Belle, who let him scratch her fuzzy ears. Alex looked into the mule's eyes and thought about all the history she had seen. Thank you for telling me about Belle, Alex said. Now you know what Dr. King meant when he told us that even though we led simple, hard lives, we were still somebody, she said. And even an old mule can be a hero, Alex added. Miss Petaway smiled and walked away, leading Belle behind her. And here's a look at the author's note that explains how the mules were used to carry Dr. King's coffin through the streets of Atlanta. And there's an actual picture. And that is the end. And this is a true story. So
my name is Luciana Bendoff. I was born here in Gee's Bend in 1960. When I was 12, I made my first quilt. Quilting was always around us, because back then in Gee's Bend it was really cold, and so it was something that was done because we needed it.
I get my design from my mind. I be sitting there thinking about how I wanted to make a quilt, and then it just come in my head how I wanted to make it. I piece it with the machine, and then when I get ready to quilt it, I get the lining and the batting. That's good. Roll this up for you. Come on, Minister.
And that you would put into frames. If you get a chance to see a quilt frame that we use, and workhorses that carpenter used to build on it. We use them as quilting frame. We call them our quilting horses. And we put them in the frame, and that's how we quilt. There's 3 layers to a quilt, and you would have to quilt all those layers by hand.
When we be sitting around the quilt, we be talking about the Lord and talking about how kids act, and we be praying, and we be singing, we be moaning, and then sometimes we be snacking on the quilt, have some fruit or something there on the quilt, and we be snacking on the quilt.
Somebody knocking at your door. Oh, sinner, why don't you answer? Somebody knocking at your door.
But I decided to try to find my own identity in quilt making. So I wanted to make a quilt to honor my mom and Alonzo, which is my mom's first cousin. My mom's favorite color is hot pink. So I decided, I said, I'll make something with hot pink, and I'll make something that's kind of easy, but I'll put a twist in it. And so I decided to put a triangle not quite into the center of the quilt, but off to the side and kind of like a window. I love looking out of windows. I always have since I was a little girl. And I said, and this is kind of like looking back into my past. Looking back into the past, but not quite going all the way back into the past.
Well, if anybody asks you who I am, oh, who I am, oh, who I am. Well, if anybody asks you who I am, just tell them I'm a child of.
It was really hard when I was growing up. We had nothing but the fireplace and the stove in the kitchen to keep warm. And we had to make quilts to keep warm.
In a lonely graveyard, many miles away, lies your dear old mother beneath the cold clay. Memories oft returning of her tears and sighs. If you love your mother, meet her in the sky.
And I like old material. I like khakis, I like jeans, I like Gangnam shirts, corduroy, but new material. I don't like new clothes. It's too hard to work with. I like something been worn, a lot of love and a lot of softness.
These are the sort of the basic, what we think of as the basic building blocks of the Gee's Bend quilt pattern. It's the house top and the bricklayer quilts. The idea is using rectangles and squares of fabric to build up your design. And the quilters themselves have said that making a quilt is like building a house. You start with one room here, you add another, and keep on adding on. And that's exactly how these have been created. Taking a few basic designs, they run with them, and they've made them their own and are able to create infinite variety from just, you know, a few basic shapes.
I'd call this quilt a crazy quilt, because he'd put together all sorts of ways. And my mom said, call it a crazy quilt, and that's what I called it, crazy quilt. I always had a mind to do something, and if you want to do something, you could do it. It ain't nothing we can't do if we want to do. And I believe that to my heart.
So we're gonna make our Gee's Bend quilt square, and you're gonna get 3 sheets of paper. One of them is gonna be the base that you glue your other pieces on, so you do not need to cut that one square. You'll be cutting the other pieces. Now you're going to see some examples of Gee's Bend quilts, and the thing to recognize is they're not perfect squares and rectangles and triangles. So I'm actually going to cut some strips out of my green paper, and I'm kind of purposefully making them so they're not exactly perfect. And then I might take one of these and cut some different sizes of square and rectangle size pieces. Maybe this one will make it a little thinner. Like I said, not perfect. There's some pieces there, and I might make a few of these shorter. Now the idea behind their quilts, when I said it's like jazz music, is some jazz musicians will sort of play as they go, making along the beats, working together. So I'm gonna design as I go. I'm not going to plan it all out with a sketch or anything like that. I'm going to start laying pieces together with how it feels. And I like to think about balance. So maybe I'm going to have, if I have some lime green on the left, I'm going to have some on the right. Maybe I'm going to throw some turquoise in here. I'm not trying to make it look any specific way. It's like an abstract piece of art. Now to me, that's looking pretty balanced because I have a little bit of the green and maybe a little bit of the turquoise should go up there. Maybe something like that. Then you might not like it. You might take the whole thing off and start again. And maybe you're gonna start in a different way, like this. So play around until you get a design that you like. And once you do, you're gonna glue it down. You can use a glue stick or you can use some liquid glue, whichever you have. And I'm gonna start gluing. So for my glue stick, one thing to remember, just gonna roll it up a little bit, is you don't wanna glue the big paper because you might put too little or way too much. You're gonna glue the paper that you wanna stick down. So I'm gonna put the glue, pressing down pretty hard because I want it to stay there. And I'm gonna press down firmly. Now you're only gonna glue until once you have an idea of how you like it to be. So I'm gonna kind of go with the original design I made, starting with my green pieces here. And if you don't want to press down hard yet, you can kind of do it lightly, and then that way if you want to move it around, you can. So maybe I'm gonna put these like so. I think I might do this one here. If you're using the liquid glue, that'll be a little bit different. Now I'm done with my glue stick, so remember always snap the cap so it stays nicely. If you're using the liquid glue, you just need a little dot of it, and you really want to just mainly get the corners, and then if you can kind of spread it on the edges and a little bit in the middle, that way it'll stay put. So I'm going to lay that down. Those I can stick down. I feel pretty good about those. Get my little four corners there. Maybe a piece here. I feel like I need a little bit more turquoise, don't you? Maybe up here. Let's see. I like to play around with it, make sure I'm happy. Maybe like that.